Picture a country where every man is supposedly jealous and controlling, where you get ripped off on every corner, where a dictator holds power with no real elections, and where tourism just means a fenced-in, all-inclusive resort surrounded by poverty and chaos on the outside. That's roughly the composite image of Turkey in the head of someone who's never lived there. Someone who knows the country from a friend's stories, news headlines, and maybe 2 weeks at an all-inclusive in Antalya. Today, we're breaking down 35 myths about Turkey, a country that, for a lot of Americans, is at once a go-to beach vacation, an increasingly popular place to retire or relocate to, and, at the same time, a pile of stereotypes nobody's really bothered to fact-check. Some of these myths will turn out to be flat-out true, some will turn out to be complete fiction, and some will land somewhere in between and need an honest, careful conversation. One heads up before we start. One section today touches on politics, Erdogan, Turkey's relationship with Russia, the Kurdish question, and I'm going to handle that as carefully and factually as I can, leaning on verifiable facts rather than anyone's emotional shortcuts, because the subject is too sensitive to flatten into slogans from either side. Get comfortable. This is going to be a long, detailed ride. I made a point of pulling from more than just travel blog sources for this one. Turkish sociologists' research, data from international organizations, and local Turkish press across the political spectrum. Because Turkey is such a personal, emotionally loaded topic for a lot of viewers that it deserves more careful scrutiny than your average resort hack video. One more thing. The whole true or false framing is, in places, going to be an oversimplification, because some of today's points are less black and white and more true for one region or one social group of the country and completely false for another. And I'll be upfront about that internal variation wherever it comes up, instead of forcing one single answer onto an 85 million person country. Let's start with a myth practically every woman who's ever seriously dated a Turkish man, or even just swapped resort romance stories with friends, has heard. All Turkish men are supposedly jealous, controlling, and obsessed with tracking their partner's every move. There's a real cultural basis here, and there's a huge oversimplification layered on top of it. Turkish society really is, in a lot of ways, more patriarchal than the average European country, especially in the conservative regions of central and eastern Anatolia, where traditional gender roles within the family run stronger than in Istanbul or along the Mediterranean coast. But treating that as a universal trait of every single Turkish man means ignoring the country's enormous regional and social diversity. In big cities like Istanbul, Izmir, or Ankara, there's a large, educated, secular class where gender roles in the family look a lot like anywhere in Europe, where women hold leadership positions and pick their own partners without deferring to family pressure. What's more, Turkish women's rights organizations themselves have spent years fighting exactly these patriarchal practices in conservative regions, and it's a genuinely internal Turkish issue, not something dreamed up by foreign observers, meaning the problem is real, but it's spread extremely unevenly across the country, and talking about it as one universal trait of the Turkish man is the same oversimplification we've run into with other countries in this series. Worth mentioning the divorce statistics separately here. The divorce rate in major Turkish cities has risen noticeably over the past 2 decades, something sociologists link directly to women's growing economic independence and shifting social expectations around marriage, a trend that runs directly counter to the image of a society where a woman is supposedly doomed to stay stuck in an unhappy marriage under patriarchal pressure forever. Sociologists studying Turkish family life also point to a striking generational split within a single family. It's not unusual for the grandmother to hold the most conservative views on a woman's role, the mother to sit somewhere in the middle, and the daughter, raised in a far more urbanized, globalized environment, to build her own relationships on terms practically indistinguishable from Western European norms. Meaning, the same myth can be both true and false within literally one family, depending on which generation you're talking about. It's telling that mixed marriages between Turkish men and foreign women have existed for decades, and far from all of them fit the dramatic arc of a resort romance turning into control and isolation that reality TV-style tough life stories shows love to feature. Plenty of these families live perfectly happy lives for years, and Turkish forums and online communities dedicated specifically to intercultural marriages are full of stories of completely normal partnerships that just aren't as interesting to talk about as the rare dramatic cases. Turkish family law has also gone through noticeable liberalization toward protecting women's rights over the past 2 decades. The Law on Protection from Domestic Violence, passed in 2012, is formally considered one of the more progressive in the region, though human rights organizations inside Turkey itself regularly criticize the gap between what the law says and how it's actually enforced on the ground, especially in conservative provinces, which makes for a story of gradual, uneven progress rather than one of unchanging, permanent patriarchy. Notably, Turkey became, in 2011, the first country to sign the Council of Europe's so-called Istanbul Convention on Preventing Violence Against Women, named after the Turkish city where it was signed, and then, in 2021, became the first to withdraw from that same convention under pressure from conservative religious circles, an episode Turkish and international rights advocates called a serious step backward, one that sparked waves of protests by women across the country, and once again confirmed that gender equality remains a live, unresolved fault line in domestic Turkish politics. Turkish courts subsequently found the withdrawal process itself legally questionable, since the decision was made by presidential decree without going through a parliamentary vote, sparking a separate line of litigation inside the country over the procedure for exiting international treaties, a legal dispute that, as of this recording, still hadn't been finally settled by the country's highest courts. Myth number 2. Turks are, across the board, extremely religious and live under strict Islamic rules. Turkey has officially been a secular state since Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's reforms in the 1920s, and that secular character is legally enshrined in the constitution, even though the religiosity of society has visibly grown over the past 2 decades under the ruling party, compared to the more secular 1990s. The real picture depends heavily on the region and the individual. In Istanbul, you'll just as easily spot a woman in a hijab and a woman in a miniskirt walking down the same street. Find a bar serving alcohol 2 blocks from a mosque and see Friday prayers pack a mosque full. But far from every Turk attends mosque regularly at all. Surveys from Turkish research institutes consistently show that a significant share of urban youth describe themselves as non-religious or moderately religious, and that share has been growing for years despite the government's official conservative rhetoric, meaning the religiosity of Turkish society is far more varied and far less monolithic than it looks from the outside. The holy month of Ramadan is a good indicator of this real variation. In conservative Anatolian towns, most cafes and restaurants close during daylight hours out of respect for those fasting, while in Istanbul's tourist districts or along the Mediterranean coast, businesses keep running as usual for tourists and non-religious locals, and the drummers who wake people before dawn for the last meal before the fast, a tradition that still survives in some neighborhoods, are seen by part of the urban youth more as colorful folklore than as a mandatory part of their own daily religious practice. The evening fast-breaking meal, iftar, has also picked up an unexpectedly secular dimension in recent years. Some big city governments organize mass, free street dinners open to anyone, regardless of faith, which part of the urban population sees less as a religious ritual than as a social, communal act of solidarity, open to tourists who happen to be in town at that time of year too. Also worth mentioning is the Sufi tradition, best known for the whirling dervishes of the Mevlevi order, a branch of Islam with a strong mystical and poetic bent, named after the poet Jalaluddin Rumi, whose poems about love and union with the divine have been translated into dozens of languages and are revered well beyond the Islamic world, which by itself sits awkwardly with the image of a single strict religiosity this myth paints. The annual whirling dervish ritual in the city of Konya, which draws thousands of pilgrims and tourists from around the world, is on UNESCO's list of humanity's intangible cultural heritage, and this branch of Islam was historically built around music, poetry, and dance as a path to God, which is radically different from the far more common Western image of a purely strict Islamic worship stripped of any aesthetic or artistic dimension. Myth number 3. Polygamy is widespread and officially permitted in Turkey. This isn't true. Polygamy was legally banned in Turkey all the way back in 1926 as part of the same Ataturk reforms that replaced religious law with secular civil law. And since then, it's simply impossible to officially register more than one marriage in the country. Isolated cases of unofficial polygamy do turn up in some conservative rural areas through religious, legally unrecognized ceremonies, and Turkish authorities periodically run campaigns against this exact practice, precisely because it's illegal and hurts the rights of women in these unions, who have no legal protection. But presenting this as a normal legal practice in Turkish society confuses a rare violation of the law with the law itself. Interestingly, abolishing polygamy in the 1920s alongside introducing civil marriage modeled on the Swiss system was one of Ataturk's most radical reforms and faced serious resistance from the conservative part of society at the time, meaning modern Turkish family law, in its legal structure, is actually much closer to the continental European model than to the family law of most other Muslim-majority countries. This same family law reform made Turkey, at the time, one of the first majority Muslim countries where women got equal rights to divorce and inheritance back in the 1920s, well before comparable rights were secured in some European countries. For example, Turkish women got the right to vote in 1934, earlier than in France or Italy. The first female Supreme Court justice in the Muslim world was also a Turkish woman, and the world's first female combat pilot. Ataturk's adopted daughter, Sabiha Gökçen, flew military aircraft as early as the 1930s. One of Istanbul's biggest airports was later named after her, meaning state-driven feminism from the top down was a deliberate, consistent part of Ataturk's Republican project from the earliest years of the country's existence, which sits awkwardly with the image of a society where women's status is invariably defined purely by religious conservatism. Myth number 4. Turks dislike foreign tourists, and Russian tourists specifically, and deliberately try to rip them off. The reality here is a lot more pragmatic than any kind of national grudge. Turkey's tourism industry has historically, and to this day, depended enormously on the Russian-speaking tourist flow. We're talking millions of tourists a year, which is exactly why staff at major resort hotels learn roster en masse. Menus get translated into Russian faster than into a lot of other languages, and entire districts of Antalya and Alanya grew up specifically around serving that audience. Cases of tourists getting scammed really do happen, but they happen just as often to people of any nationality wherever there's developed tourist infrastructure and a temptation to profit off a visitor's lack of local knowledge. That's a universal problem of mass tourism, not some specific dislike for one particular nationality. What's more, entire coastal economies in Antalya, Alanya, and Sid have grown up over the past 30 years literally around serving the Russian-speaking flow. Russian language schools have opened for the children of relocated families. Orthodox churches serve the permanent expat community, and plenty of shop and cafe signs are duplicated in Russian just as often as in English. Hard to imagine a clearer rebuttal to the dislike myth than an entire local economy built around one specific nationality. After the mass relocation of Russians in 2022, Turkish banks and real estate agencies were even among the first in the world to quickly adapt their services to the needs of the new wave of arrivals. Simplified procedures for foreigners opening bank accounts appeared. Specialized legal firms sprang up to help with residency permits, and entire neighborhoods in Istanbul and Antalya today have Russian-language signage that's arguably just as common as Turkish. The Kadıköy district on the Asian side of Istanbul was even informally nicknamed Little Moscow among relocated Russians themselves, for the concentration of Russian-language cafes, co-working spaces, and book clubs that popped up there within months of the mass relocation starting. A sight that would genuinely surprise an outsider who only knows Istanbul from tourist postcards of mosques. By various migration researchers' estimates, within the first couple of years of the mass relocation, the number of Russian and Ukrainian citizens officially living in Turkey ran into the hundreds of thousands, making Turkey one of the key destinations for this new wave of emigration, right alongside Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. And Turkish international schools teaching the Cambridge or American curriculum reported a sharp rise in Russian-speaking students specifically during this period. Turkish authorities, for their part, adapted immigration rules fairly quickly to the surge in residency applications, introducing minimum rental value requirements and caps on the density of foreign residents in certain neighborhoods, something part of the relocated community saw as a tightening of the rules, and part of Turkish analysts saw as an attempt by the government to balance the benefits of an inflow of foreign money against growing local resentment over the sharp spike in rents in neighborhoods popular with foreigners. Myth number 5 from this block. All Turks look uniformly dark-skinned, closer to Arab than European in appearance. Turkey sits geographically and historically at the crossroads of Europe, the Caucasus, the Middle East, and Central Asia, and that shows up in the population's striking physical diversity. On the Black Sea coast, you'll find fair-skinned, light-haired people whose looks are closer to Balkan or Caucasus peoples. Central Anatolia has a darker-skinned, dark-haired look, and the regions bordering Syria and Iraq show clear Arab and Kurdish cultural and genetic influence. Turks themselves are well aware of and openly discuss this internal diversity, and foreigners' surprise that not all Turks are dark-skinned is just the typical reaction of someone who pictured the whole country based on one stereotyped postcard image. Genetic studies of the Turkish population, conducted by independent research groups, confirm this diversity at the DNA level. The modern Turkish population formed from a mix of numerous ancient Anatolian peoples, with Turkic nomadic tribes arriving from Central Asia in the 11th century, plus Balkan, Caucasus, and Middle Eastern groups over the following centuries of Ottoman expansion. Meaning this physical diversity has a perfectly explainable historical and genetic backstory, not random chance. Interestingly, the Turkic nomadic tribes that gave the country its name and language were actually a relative minority compared to the local Byzantine, Armenian, and Kurdish population of the region at the time they arrived in Anatolia, and the modern Turkish language nonetheless remains Turkic in its grammatical structure, meaning the language and cultural identity spread to a much larger and more diverse local population, in a pattern that resembles, structurally, how Latin and Roman identity once spread across the whole Mediterranean centuries earlier. Modern Turkish surnames, incidentally, appeared relatively recently by historical standards. The law requiring mandatory surnames wasn't passed until 1934, and that's the same year Parliament granted Mustafa Kemal himself the surname Ataturk, literally meaning "Father of the Turks," through a special separate act that banned anyone else from ever bearing that surname. A rare case in world history of a specific surname being officially and permanently reserved for one single person across an entire country. And the last, 6th myth in this block about people. The Turkish mindset boils down to fleecing tourists for money whenever possible. Turkish culture really does have a tradition of active, sometimes assertive, market haggling, part of a centuries-old trading culture going back to Ottoman bazaars. And locals see it not as a scam, but as a normal part of commercial interaction that both sides consciously take part in. At the same time, hospitality is valued in Turkish culture every bit as much as bargaining skill, and a foreigner who ends up in a Turkish home or among local friends is far more likely to run into almost overwhelming warmth and generosity than any attempt to profit off them. It's just that the tourist zone and everyday Turkish life are two completely different social contexts with different unwritten rules. Travelers who've spent enough time in Turkey outside hotel resorts regularly tell stories of a random Turkish neighbor or shopkeeper at a local market inviting them for tea with no ulterior motive at all, purely out of politeness, or a stranger spending a solid hour personally walking a lost foreigner to the right address and flatly refusing any payment for the help. This tradition of hospitality is so culturally strong that Turks themselves often joke about the contrast between the image of the hustling tourist zone operator and how that exact same person behaves at home with a guest. The Turkish proverb, "A guest is a blessing from God," remains an active social code in practice, not just a nice-sounding phrase. In many regions of the country, it's still considered almost unthinkable to let a guest leave the house without offering food at least 3 times, even if it creates an obvious inconvenience for the host. Now let's move to the block on tourism and Turkey's famous all-inclusive resorts, because there's just as much distorted thinking piled up here as in the section on national character. First myth: all the all-inclusive hotels in Turkey are basically the same, and the differences are purely cosmetic. In reality, Turkey's hotel industry has built one of the most detailed star rating and internal competition systems in world tourism. The gap between a 5-star hotel in Belek with a golf course, a water park, and a Michelin-trained chef, and a run-of-the-mill 3-star hotel in a residential part of Kemer can be bigger than the gap between a luxury and a budget hotel anywhere else in the world. It's just that the marketing cliché, all-inclusive, gets slapped on both extremes equally, creating an illusion of sameness where there isn't any. Experienced travel agents and travel bloggers spend years putting together detailed, independent rankings of specific hotels precisely because a hotel's official star category in Turkey doesn't always directly track real service quality. And the gap between 2 neighboring hotels with the same star rating on the same street can be enormous, depending on which specific chain operator runs it. The whole concept of all-inclusive in its current Turkish form, unlimited alcohol, poolside bars, evening entertainment shows, actually took shape as the Turkish hotel industry's answer to competition from Egypt and Tunisia in the 1990s, when hoteliers realized that predictable costs for a tourist traveling on a fixed family vacation budget sold better than a system of add-on charges for every little thing, meaning the format, in its Turkish version, is younger than people assume, and largely a product of deliberate 1990s marketing strategy rather than some centuries-old hospitality tradition. Myth number 2. Turkish beaches are all overcrowded, dirty, and built up wall-to-wall with hotels. Turkey's Mediterranean and Aegean coastline really is densely developed in the most popular resort zones, like Antalya or Bodrum, at the peak of high season. And the myth is fair enough for those specific locations and specific months. But Turkey's coastline stretches for thousands of kilometers, and there are plenty of far less hyped, sometimes genuinely wild beaches, especially along the Black Sea coast, or in the less touristy parts of the Aegean region, where it's mostly Turks themselves showing up for the weekend rather than organized foreign tour groups, meaning overcrowding is a feature of specific mass tourism hotspots, not a universal trait of the entire Turkish coast. The Datça Peninsula, or the Kaş region in the southwest, for instance, offer a far more intimate atmosphere, with clear water and pine forests running right down to the sea, even though the infrastructure there is just as good. It's just that the tourist flow gets there differently, mostly through individual bookings rather than big charter packages, which automatically keeps the density of vacationers lower at any given moment. The Aegean coast around Bodrum and Marmaris itself is far more jagged. with dozens of small coves and bays, many reachable only by boat, a format locals and experienced travelers call a blue cruise, where the vacation happens not in a fixed hotel, but aboard a sailboat moving from one secluded cove to another, which is a radical departure from the wall-to-wall built-up beachfront image this myth paints. Myth number 3. Alcohol is effectively banned or extremely hard to get in Turkey because of Islamic law. Alcohol is legal in Turkey, sold in supermarkets, bars, and restaurants across the country, and the local anise spirit, rakı, is considered the national drink with a centuries-long history, served in practically any traditional meze restaurant. That said, over the past 15 years, the ruling party has genuinely introduced a series of restrictive measures: higher taxes, bans on nighttime sales in some stores, restrictions on alcohol advertising, which has really made access harder compared to the more liberal 1990s and noticeably driven up prices. But that's nowhere near the same thing as the total ban this myth describes. Turkish opposition politicians, and part of the business community tied to the restaurant and tourism industries, regularly criticize these restrictive measures as an attempt to push a more conservative lifestyle through economic levers rather than a direct legislative ban, one of the more telling illustrations of a broader Turkish political debate over the balance between secular and religiously conservative values in day-to-day state policy. Worth noting, too, that winemaking in Anatolia is one of the oldest traditions in the world. Archaeological finds in what's now eastern Turkey are considered among the oldest evidence of human winemaking anywhere, long predating the arrival of Islam in the region, and several modern Turkish wine regions, especially in Cappadocia and along the Aegean coast, have picked up recognition at international wine competitions in recent years. A fairly ironic pairing with the stereotype of a country where alcohol is supposedly under a hard ban. Turkey's brewing tradition also has a genuinely modern commercial story. The biggest Turkish beer brand, Efes, is sold not just domestically, but exported to several dozen countries, and in recent years, especially in Istanbul, the number of craft breweries aimed at a young urban crowd has grown noticeably, pointing more to a growing culture of alcohol consumption than a disappearing one. Myth number 4. Istanbul and Antalya are basically all of Turkish tourism, and the rest of the country holds nothing of interest for a traveler. In reality, Turkey has 19 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, including the otherworldly lunar landscapes of Cappadocia with sunrise hot air balloon flights, the snow-white travertine terraces of Pamukkale, the ancient city of Ephesus, one of the best-preserved Roman-era cities on the Mediterranean, and underground cities carved directly into the rock by early Christians hiding from persecution, some going down dozens of meters and capable of sheltering thousands of people at once, along with livestock and food supplies in case of a prolonged siege. Eastern Anatolia, with Mount Ararat and its Kurdish and Armenian cultural memory, and the Black Sea coast, with its damp green mountains and an entirely different, far less famous cuisine, are completely off the radar for the vast majority of beach tourists, who see literally one coastal resort complex and nothing else of the country. The capital, Ankara, incidentally, isn't a tourist destination in the usual sense at all, even though it's home to the largest mausoleum in the world built for a modern leader, the Anıtkabir complex honoring Ataturk, and one of the richest museums of Anatolian civilizations, displaying artifacts from the Hittite era, which existed in this territory more than 1,000 years before the classical Greek period that people far more often think of when discussing the region's ancient history. Eastern Anatolia is home to one of humanity's oldest known ritual structures of all, the Göbekli Tepe complex, built roughly 11,000 years before the modern era, meaning thousands of years before the Egyptian pyramids, and even before the emergence of agriculture itself. A discovery that forced archaeologists to rethink long-held assumptions about the order in which humanity moved from hunting and gathering to organized religious and social life. Excavation at Göbekli Tepe still covers only a small fraction of the complex's total area, and the archaeologists working there regularly say in interviews that the real discoveries capable of rewriting the textbooks on early human history may still be waiting underground. A rare case where Turkey's archaeological heritage carries potential significance, not just for the country's own history, but for understanding the origins of civilization as a whole. Myth number 5. Theft from tourists is rampant at Turkish hotels, and it's not safe to leave valuables there. As with any major tourism industry, theft cases do happen in Turkey, and a certain level of caution is warranted anywhere in the world with developed tourism. But Turkish authorities and the hotel industry itself have a huge stake in reputation, since tourism makes up a significant share of the country's GDP. And major chain hotels invest in security systems, in-room safes, and CCTV every bit as much as comparable establishments in Spain or Greece. Theft statistics at the average Turkish resort hotel don't stand out with anything catastrophic compared to other popular Mediterranean destinations. What's more, large tour operators sending millions of clients to Turkey every year have to factor in exactly this kind of risk as part of their reputational and legal liability, meaning any systemic security problems at specific hotels tend to become known fairly quickly through reviews and ratings and lead to contracts being cut with unreliable properties. A genuinely functioning market self-regulation mechanism for the industry. Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism also runs an official hotel certification system, occasionally downgrading or revoking a property's star rating after inspections find it falling short of stated standards. And cases like this are periodically covered in the local press as a form of public pressure on unreliable operators trying to protect the whole industry's reputation in the eyes of foreign tour operators. And the last myth in this block. Turkish police are corrupt and simply won't bother with a case involving a foreigner. In recent years, Turkish authorities have set up specialized tourist police units, specifically in resort areas, whose officers often speak several foreign languages and are trained to handle exactly these kinds of visitor issues, from lost documents to disputes with dishonest vendors or taxi drivers. That doesn't mean corruption doesn't exist as a phenomenon in Turkish law enforcement at all. It periodically becomes a topic of domestic Turkish political debate. But presenting it as a guaranteed obstacle for a tourist dealing with an everyday problem ignores the real infrastructure built specifically to handle situations like this. There's also a dedicated hotline for foreign tourists, staffed in several languages around the clock during high season, and consulates from countries with a large tourist flow, including Russia, regularly work with local police to protect their citizens' rights, adding an extra practical layer of protection on top of the Turkish law enforcement system itself. Russian tourists can also reach out to Russian-language representative offices run by major tour operators that maintain a permanent presence in resort areas. And in practice, most everyday disputes, from a misunderstanding over a restaurant bill to an argument with a taxi driver, get resolved through that channel before any police involvement at all, which often turns out faster than the official process. The Russian consulate in Antalya, incidentally, was opened specifically because of the sheer volume of Russian tourist traffic to the region, itself a rare example of a country opening an additional consular office in a resort region specifically for the convenience of its own tourists, rather than for residents or the business community. Let's turn to the economy and standard of living, because there's just as much distortion piled up here as in the earlier blocks. First myth. The Turkish lira is worthless, and the country is stuck in a permanent, irreversible economic crisis. The Turkish lira genuinely went through a period of exceptionally sharp devaluation and high inflation over the past several years, which was a serious ordeal for ordinary Turkish families and noticeably hit their purchasing power. That's a confirmed, serious economic fact, not an exaggeration. By various independent estimates, real inflation during certain peak months significantly exceeded official government figures, which led to the formation of an alternative group of independent Turkish economists publishing their own, more conservative inflation calculations, precisely because part of society and the business community stopped trusting the official statistics alone, a practice that, by itself, says a lot about the level of trust in state economic institutions during the height of the crisis. But at the same time, Turkey remains one of the largest economies in the world by nominal GDP. Sits in the G20, has a powerful industrial base in textiles, automotive manufacturing, and defense. And the Turkish government has, in recent years, taken steps to stabilize the exchange rate, including shifting economic course and raising interest rates. Meaning a real crisis in purchasing power coexists with the country's continuing status as a large, diversified economy, not a state on the verge of total collapse. Tellingly, even at the height of the currency crisis, the Turkish stock market and certain export-oriented sectors, including tourism and textiles, paradoxically benefited from the weak lira, since it made Turkish goods and services cheaper for foreign buyers and tourists, meaning the same economic process simultaneously hit local residents' wallets and created a competitive advantage for entire sectors of the export economy. Myth number 2. Everything in Turkey is just cheap, full stop. This is an oversimplification closely tied to the previous myth about the weak lira. For a tourist arriving with the currency of a stronger economy, resort and everyday costs in Turkey really do often look like a bargain because of the exchange rate gap. But for Turks themselves, earning their salary in lira, domestic prices have risen very sharply as a result of that same high inflation. And the average Turkish worker's purchasing power has noticeably declined in recent years. Meaning cheap for the foreign tourist and expensive for the local resident are two sides of the same currency story, not a contradiction. A clear illustration of this paradox is prices at Istanbul cafes and restaurants for middle-class local customers, which Turkish families describe year after year as increasingly out of reach for regular visits, while that exact same bill, converted into dollars or rubles at the current exchange rate, looks downright modest to a visiting tourist, meaning the same check can simultaneously be seen as expensive by a local and cheap by a foreigner. And both are right, just working off different frames of purchasing power. Plenty of middle-class Turkish families told journalists at the height of the crisis that they'd switched to weekly rather than monthly budget planning, precisely because prices on basic goods could shift noticeably within just a few weeks, a budgeting practice that would have been unthinkable for a stably employed urban Turkish professional just 10 years earlier. Some Turkish restaurants and cafes, at the peak of the most acute inflationary phase, even ditched printed menus in favor of QR codes, simply because reprinting price tags was happening too often, and a digital menu could be updated weekly at no extra printing cost. A small but telling detail of everyday life reflecting the scale and speed of the price swings taking place. Turkish unions and opposition economists have pointed for years to this exact gap as one of the country's main domestic political problems. The government periodically raises the minimum wage to offset inflation, but that indexing usually fails to keep pace with the real rise in prices on basic goods, which has become a persistent topic of economic debate across Turkish media, regardless of political leaning. Turkey's central bank has, in recent years, sharply reversed its monetary policy course several times, moving from an unconventional rate-cutting approach that defied classical economic theory to a sharp rate hike following a change in bank leadership. And these reversals have themselves become a subject of study in Western economic publications as a rare example of such dramatic macroeconomic policy swings in a major emerging economy within just a few years. Myth number 3. Turkey is a poor third-world country. Turkey is classified by international financial organizations as an upper-middle-income country with developed industry, a large auto sector including exports of its own domestic car brands, a powerful textile and construction industry operating across the world from the Middle East to Africa, and one of the most developed defense industries among countries outside the traditional military powers, including its own drone production, which has earned worldwide recognition. Under the World Bank's classification, Turkey falls into the upper middle income category, sitting right at the threshold of high-income status, putting it in the same bracket as countries like Malaysia or Mexico, but noticeably above the classic examples of third-world developing states, like most of sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, with which Turkey is sometimes mistakenly lumped in purely by association with the Middle East. Living standards in major Turkish cities are quite comparable to many Eastern and Southern European countries, with a noticeable lag in the interior rural region, typical of a lot of developing economies with a mixed structure. By nominal GDP, Turkey consistently ranks among the 20 largest economies in the world, ahead of countries like the Netherlands or Switzerland in absolute output, though noticeably behind them on GDP per capita, which is exactly what reflects that same internal unevenness in wealth and regional disparity we've been talking about. Turkey is also among the world's largest agricultural producers, including hazelnuts, figs, and apricots, where the country often ranks first in the world by export volume. And Turkish construction machinery manufacturing and contracting firms carry out massive infrastructure projects, not just domestically, but under contracts in dozens of countries across the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia, making Turkish construction exports a significant line item of national income that rarely gets mentioned outside specialized economic press. Turkish contractors have, in recent years, consistently ranked among the top 20 largest construction companies in the world by volume of international contracts, according to annual industry ranking, competing in this respect with far better-known firms from China, South Korea, and the Gulf states, making Turkish construction exports a significant, if little known to the general public, source of national income. Turkish migrant workers and specialists also work under contract on major construction sites across the Middle East and Central Asia, sending money home, which creates an additional, if less visible than tourism statistics, channel of foreign currency inflows into the country's economy. Myth number 4, especially relevant given how many foreigners have been eyeing Turkish property in recent years. Buying real estate in Turkey is guaranteed to be a profitable investment with no risk whatsoever. Turkey's real estate market really is actively marketed to foreign buyers, including through a government program granting Turkish citizenship for a certain level of investment, and plenty of foreign buyers, especially from Russia and other former Soviet countries, have bought property there in recent years. But the currency risk cuts both ways here. Property is most often valued and sold in lira, and its real dollar or ruble return depends heavily on that same exchange rate volatility discussed earlier. Plus, certain regions and projects carry genuine risks tied to developer quality, the legal cleanliness of the deal, and market oversaturation in specific resort zones, meaning the investment can work out, but calling it guaranteed risk-free ignores the very real financial horror stories of people who invested poorly. It's also worth noting that the Citizenship by Investment program itself periodically changes its threshold amounts and conditions, and the Turkish government has repeatedly raised the minimum investment threshold in recent years, precisely because of a sharp spike in foreign demand. Meaning the terms of a deal that were current 3 years ago can look quite different from today's. And relying on outdated information from a random blog is a common mistake among people who later end up disappointed with this investment. Worth keeping in mind, too, that returns on renting out Turkish property vary a lot by season and location. An apartment in central Istanbul aimed at long-term rental to local professionals behaves completely differently on the market than a resort studio in Alanya, whose returns depend almost entirely on the tourist season and the international tourist flow, itself subject to swings depending on geopolitics and flight connections between countries. Myth number 5. Turkish goods are cheap, low-quality, mass-market junk. This stereotype is largely as outdated as the similar myth about Chinese goods we covered in an earlier video in this series. Turkish textiles have long been supplied to the world's biggest fashion brands, including premium European fashion houses. Turkish appliance makers like Beko or Vestel sell across Europe under their own and partner brands. And Turkish auto manufacturing produces components and entire models for major global car companies at its own factories. Of course, as with any major manufacturing country, there's product of every quality level depending on the specific manufacturer and price segment. The claiming Turkish manufacturing is systemically low quality across the board ignores its real integration into the global supply chains of premium brands. Turkey also remains one of the world's largest cotton producers and one of the world's major hubs of textile design and garment making. In certain Istanbul districts, like Murder, are known across the region as wholesale hubs where buyers from dozens of countries come to buy clothing straight from the factories, cutting out middlemen entirely. An entire separate tourism industry that the average beach vacationer doesn't even know exists. Turkey's jewelry industry also holds a notable place on the world market. Istanbul is considered one of the world's biggest hubs for wholesale gold trading, and Turkish jewelry factories produce a significant share of the gold jewelry sold across the Middle East and in some European countries, something rarely associated with the country in the mind of a tourist whose souvenir shopping is limited to an airport fridge magnet before the flight home. Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, one of the oldest and largest covered markets in the world, with a centuries-long history and thousands of shops under one roof, remains not just a tourist attraction, but a working wholesale and retail jewelry center where locals still come to buy gold for a wedding or as a traditional store of value, making it a rare example of a heritage landmark that still carries out its original commercial function centuries after it was built. And the last myth in this block. The Turkish economy is entirely and exclusively dependent on tourism, and the country simply can't function without it. Tourism really is one of Turkey's most important sources of foreign currency earnings and makes up a significant share of GDP, especially in coastal regions. But the structure of the Turkish economy is much more varied. Manufacturing, agriculture, construction exports, and the defense industry combined make up a far bigger share of the country's total output than tourism itself. And Turkey exports goods to dozens of countries with no connection whatsoever to the resort season. That said, the high dependence of coastal regional economies specifically on seasonal tourist flow is a real fact. Towns like Marmaris or Bodrum really do run on a pronounced seasonal cycle, where the winter months bring a noticeable drop in business activity and temporary unemployment among seasonal staff, creating a local, regional dependence on tourism, even if it doesn't reflect the country's overall economic picture. In recent years, the Turkish government has also been actively pushing to diversify the tourism sector itself beyond classic beach vacations. Medical tourism, including dentistry, plastic surgery, and hair transplants, has turned into its own multi-billion-dollar income line, drawing patients from Europe and the Middle East specifically for the price and quality on offer at a relatively modest cost compared to Western clinics. And ski tourism in the country's eastern regions is being developed as a way to extend the tourist season into the winter months, when beach resorts traditionally sit empty. Now let's move to the block that calls for extra care on my part. The politics and state structure of modern Turkey, including President Erdogan, relations with Russia, and the Kurdish question. These topics trigger very different and sometimes directly opposing emotional reactions in different people, and I'm going to try to stick to verifiable facts, avoiding both demonizing and whitewashing either side. First myth in this block. President Erdogan is a classic lifetime dictator holding power with no real elections. The reality is more complicated. Turkey regularly holds presidential and parliamentary elections with several genuinely competing parties, and opposition candidates really have won important posts. For example, the mayoralty of Istanbul in 2019, which was a serious political shock for the ruling party. At the same time, plenty of international observers and human rights organizations have documented real problems with the fairness of the electoral process in a broader sense. Control over most major media by figures close to the government, pressure on the independent press and opposition journalists, and the 2017 constitutional reform, which significantly expanded presidential powers at Parliament's expense. So the accurate framing here isn't, "there are no elections," nor "elections are completely free and fair," but rather, elections are formally held regularly and genuine political surprises do happen at them. but the conditions of political competition are noticeably tilted in favor of the incumbent government. And that's the assessment even relatively measured international election observers themselves offer. The opposition candidate's win in the Istanbul mayoral race in 2019 became a telling story in its own right. After the first vote, which the opposition won by a narrow margin, the election board, at the ruling party's request, ordered a rerun. But in the rerun, the same opposition candidate won by a far more decisive margin, something many Turkish and foreign analysts read as a telling example that even in a heavily skewed media environment,
outright falsifying a nationwide vote count still remains a politically risky move for those in power. That said, the 2017 constitutional reform itself, which abolished the office of Prime Minister and transferred its powers to the President, passed in a referendum by a fairly narrow margin, and independent international observers from the OSCE flagged a number of procedural issues around that referendum, including a controversial decision by the election board to count unstamped ballots on voting day itself, a detail that became the subject of extended domestic political dispute inside Turkey.
Myth number 2. Turkey is an authoritarian state with a complete absence of freedom of speech. Precision matters here too. According to international organizations tracking press freedom, Turkey has consistently ranked among the worst performers among countries with a formally multi-party system for years, especially on the number of journalists under investigation or in detention on charges tied to their professional work. That said, opposition publications continue operating inside Turkey. Journalists independent of the government do work, and government policy is openly debated and criticized on social media, though some of the most high-profile posts and accounts are periodically blocked or become the subject of legal proceedings. Meaning, the situation is far from the total absence of free speech typical of the world's most closed authoritarian regimes, and equally far from the full press protections of a consolidated democracy. For several years running, Turkey ranked among the top countries in the world for the sheer number of journalists in detention, according to annual reports from international press freedom organizations, a fact regularly criticized by the EU, which Turkey has formally continued applying to join since the 1990s, even though the whole EU accession process has effectively been frozen for years, precisely because of complaints like this about the state of the country's democratic institutions. That said, it's worth noting that Turkish civil society remains far livelier and more active than press freedom metrics alone would suggest. The mass protests in Gezi Park in 2013, sparked initially by a purely local urban development dispute, grew into one of the biggest waves of civic mobilization in the country's modern history, spreading to dozens of cities, which speaks to the significant protest potential still present in Turkish society, regardless of the degree of state control over traditional media. The Gezi Park protests also became one of the first big examples of Turkish youth turning en masse to social media as an alternative real-time news source, at a moment when state TV channels, in the middle of the protests, were, as many foreign journalists wryly noted, airing documentaries about penguins instead of covering the events unfolding on the ground. An episode that itself became a lasting internet meme and a symbol of young urban audiences' distrust of traditional media, specifically at moments of crisis. The penguin, incidentally, has since turned into an informal satirical symbol of Turkish protest, and images of penguins in riot helmets or holding makeshift shields still occasionally surface on Turkish social media as a recognizable callback to those events more than a decade later. Gezi Park itself, the starting point of the whole protest wave, ultimately was never developed into the replica Ottoman-era barracks with a shopping mall that city authorities had originally planned. A rare case where mass civic resistance to a specific urban development decision actually led to that decision being scrapped, which many Turkish activists still consider one of the few tangible practical outcomes of that era's protest movement. The aesthetic of the 2013 protests itself, gas masks, homemade shields fashioned from trash cans, witty, humorous protest signs, went on to noticeably influence the visual language of subsequent protest movements elsewhere in the region, something Turkish researchers of protest culture call one of the clearest examples of a local urban event leaving a mark far beyond its own national context. Documentaries and books about the Gezi Park protests were later translated into dozens of languages and studied in Western university courses on the sociology of protest movements alongside the Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Street movement of the same historical period, making the Turkish episode part of a much broader global wave of urban protest movements in the early 2010s, rather than an isolated, purely Turkish phenomenon. Myth number 3, especially relevant given how often it comes up in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. Turkey is formally in NATO, but is actually an ally of Russia. The reality here sits between two extremes, and Turkey's own foreign policy in recent years is quite deliberately built around that balancing act. Turkey really has remained a NATO member since 1952, with the alliance's second-largest army, and at the same time maintains active economic and energy ties with Russia, including major joint infrastructure projects like the Akuyu nuclear power plant,
which is being built and will be operated by a Russian state corporation on Turkish soil under a build-own-operate model, unique in the global nuclear industry, plus a proposed gas hub. This financing model is also notable because it means Turkey's own state budget bears essentially zero direct capital cost for building the plant, since the entire project is financed and later repaid through electricity sales, something the Turkish government presents as a good deal, and critics call a form of long-term energy dependence on a foreign, in this case Russian,
operator of critically important infrastructure. At the same time, Turkey has supplied weapons, including its own attack drones, to the side opposing Russia in the war in Ukraine, while also declining to fully join Western economic sanctions against Russia. International relations analysts typically describe this policy not as an alliance with either side, but as a deliberate strategy of profiting from a position as broker between several major power centers at once, an approach Turkey itself openly calls a multi-vectored foreign policy, rather than a covert alliance with any specific side. Turkey has also played a mediating role in several rounds of negotiations and prisoner exchanges between the parties to the conflict, and the Black Sea grain export deal in the early years after the full-scale war began was one of the clearest examples of Turkish diplomacy's mediating, rather than clearly allied, role, something diplomatic analysts on both sides typically call a genuine strategic win for Turkey itself, boosting its international standing as an indispensable negotiating channel. Istanbul also hosted several rounds of direct talks between Russian and Ukrainian delegations, the first weeks after the full-scale conflict began, and while those specific talks didn't lead to an immediate ceasefire, the fact that both sides agreed to meet specifically on Turkish soil rather than in any Western capital was itself a clear demonstration of the unique trust Turkey enjoys with both sides of the conflict at once. Turkey also controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits under the 1936 International Montreux Convention, which formally gives it the right to regulate the passage of warships belonging to Black Sea states through those straits,
a legal lever the Turkish government used in the first months after the full-scale conflict in Ukraine began, restricting the passage of warships into the Black Sea. Another practical example of that same balancing, rather than clearly pro-Russian or pro-Western position. That said, the Montreux Convention itself formally limits Turkey's own options too. Even in peacetime, its own large warships can't pass through the straits in unlimited numbers, which has historically been the subject of periodic debate within Turkish military and diplomatic circles over whether this nearly century-old agreement still serves the country's modern strategic interests. Turkish companies have, at the same time, ramped up exports to Russia across a whole range of product categories, partly filling the gap left by Western brands that exited the Russian market, something Western politicians have periodically criticized as helping Russia dodge sanctions. while the Turkish side has consistently insisted on its sovereign right to trade with any partner outside the framework of formal international sanctions it never signed on to itself. That said, individual Turkish banks and companies have themselves subsequently been hit with secondary sanctions by the U.S. over specific deals Washington considered a violation of the sanctions regime, forcing Turkish businesses to constantly balance keeping profitable trade ties with Russia against the risk of losing access to the far larger Western financial system that the Turkish economy overall depends on much more heavily. Russian tourists have also become one of the main beneficiaries of the fact that after sanctions pressure began, many international payment networks suspended service for Russian bank cards abroad, while Turkish banks fairly quickly offered alternative solutions, including issuing local Turkish cards to foreign residents, further deepening an already close, everyday practical connection between the two countries. Myth number 4. The Kurdish question in Turkey is simply a case of Turks oppressing Kurds, with no other context. Here, it's worth separating out several distinct, though connected, layers of reality. Kurds are Turkey's largest ethnic minority, numbering in the tens of millions, with their own language and culture, and for decades, Kurdish cultural expression really has faced serious restrictions from the Turkish state, including many years of an outright ban on using the Kurdish language in public life and education, confirmed by numerous independent historians and human rights reports. At the same time, the Kurdish population is spread far beyond Turkey's own borders. Significant Kurdish communities also historically live in Iraq, Iran, and Syria, making Kurds one of the largest peoples in the world without their own recognized independent state. And the Kurdish question is, in effect, 4 interconnected but still distinct national stories at once, each unfolding according to its own logic, depending on the specific host country's policies. At the same time, the armed conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Turkey, the U.S., and the EU officially designate as a terrorist organization, has claimed tens of thousands of lives since the 1980s. And remains one of the longest-running internal armed conflicts in modern Europe and the Middle East. Both sides of the conflict have accused each other of serious war crimes over the decades. Human rights organizations have documented the destruction of hundreds of Kurdish villages and the forced displacement of civilians by Turkish forces in the 1990s as part of the counterinsurgency campaign, while the Kurdistan Workers' Party itself is responsible for numerous terrorist attacks against Turkish civilians in cities across the country, including major cities well beyond the predominantly Kurdish southeast. Meaning the human cost of this conflict has fallen on civilians on both sides of the line. The Kurdish language itself is now taught as an elective subject in some state schools in the country's southeast. Private Kurdish language learning centers exist, and Kurdish music and literature are openly sold in bookstores in major Turkish cities. A significant step compared to the situation just 20 or 30 years ago, even if full recognition of Kurdish as a second official state language remains politically impossible under current conditions. So the real picture includes both legitimate criticism of state cultural assimilation policy and a genuine armed conflict involving violence on both sides. And boiling it down to one simple formula in either direction means missing a substantial part of the story. Over recent decades, the situation also hasn't stood still. The ban on Kurdish in public life was officially lifted in the 2000s. State-run Kurdish language television appeared, and peace talks between the Turkish government and the Kurdish political movement have been held, with mixed success, several times over the past 2 decades, each time collapsing amid fresh outbreaks of violence. Meaning, this is more a long, unfinished story of alternating periods of rapprochement and escalation than a frozen, unchanging conflict. In 2023 and 2024, a new round of talks emerged over the Kurdish movement's possible disarmament, initiated in part through an unexpected political channel, contact with the movement's own founder, who has spent decades in Turkish prison. which some Turkish analysts considered potentially the most serious chance for a final settlement in the whole history of the conflict. Though skeptics fairly point out that previous rounds of talks also began with similar optimism before ultimately collapsing. The Kurdish region in northern neighboring Iraq, which has broad autonomy and its own government, also remains a key factor in this equation. Turkish authorities have, over many years, conducted military operations against bases of the Kurdish armed movement, specifically on Iraqi territory, which has regularly caused diplomatic friction with Baghdad, while at the same time maintaining fairly close economic ties with Iraqi Kurdistan itself, including major oil exports routed through Turkish territory. Another example of how Turkish policy on the Kurdish question plays out differently depending on the specific country and specific Kurdish political movement in question. In Syria itself, Turkish armed forces have, over the past decade, carried out several major military operations against Kurdish forces in the north of the country. Forces that were, at the same time, the Western coalition's key ground partner in the fight against the Islamic State group. A situation that, for several years, became a source of noticeable tension between Turkey and its Western NATO allies. Myth number 5. Turkey has historically been, and remains to this day, unconditionally hostile toward Armenia and Greece, with no nuance whatsoever. Turkey's relations with both countries really do remain tense and burdened by difficult historical legacy. The mass killings of the Ottoman Empire's Armenian population in 1915, which most historians and dozens of countries around the world officially recognize as genocide, are still not officially recognized as genocide by the Turkish state, which remains a serious obstacle in Turkish-Armenian relations. And territorial and maritime disputes with Greece in the Aegean periodically flare up, even to the point of military incidents in the airspace. That said, Turkey's own position on recognizing the genocide isn't a fully frozen topic inside the country. Certain Turkish intellectuals, historians, and small opposition political groups have, over the past 2 decades, increasingly openly discussed this subject inside the country, something that would have been practically unthinkable in public as recently as the 1990s, when merely mentioning Kurdish identity in public could land someone in serious legal trouble. And the famous case of the writer Orhan Pamuk, prosecuted in the early 2000s for insulting Turkishness, specifically for mentioning the mass killings of Armenians and Kurds in an interview, became an internationally resonant symbol of just how fraught this topic is for Turkish society, one that ultimately didn't stop him from winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. The criminal case against Pamuk under the Insulting Turkishness statute drew such wide international attention that the EU officially made revising that section of the criminal code one of the conditions for continuing Turkey's accession talks, and the law was indeed later softened, though similarly spirited provisions protecting state symbols and institutions remain in Turkish law today in modified form. That said, diplomatic relations between Turkey and Armenia have, in recent years, gone through periods of cautious thaw, including the opening of direct flights and talks on normalization, and Turkey and Greece, despite regular diplomatic tension, remain NATO allies and cooperate on a number of practical matters, including joint disaster response, meaning the tension is real, but it doesn't rule out periods of practical cooperation. A telling episode came in 2023, when, after the devastating earthquake in Turkey, Greek rescue teams were among the first to arrive in the affected areas, and Turkish media widely covered this gesture of solidarity as a rare moment of warming between historic rivals. Humanitarian aid amid a century of rivalry became, for both countries, an occasion for cautious but noticeable diplomatic rapprochement in the following months. The territorial dispute in the Aegean, meanwhile, isn't just about maritime borders. It also touches on the status of airspace over dozens of small islands, which is why Turkish and Greek military aircraft regularly log mutual airspace violations, and outlets in both countries publish annual statistics on incidents like this every year, something that's long since turned into a kind of ritual element of bilateral relations,
treated more as routine posturing than a genuine threat of military confrontation. And the last myth in this dense block: military coups in Turkey are a routine, almost regular occurrence, happening practically every decade with no real consequences. Turkey really has gone through several military coups and coup attempts in its modern history, starting in 1960, and the Turkish military was, for a long time, seen as guardian of the country's secular order, ready to step in if that order came under threat. But treating this as a routine, near-normalized event underestimates the real human and political consequences of each episode.
The last coup attempt in 2016 killed more than 250 people, triggered massive purges across the military, judiciary, and education system, affecting tens of thousands of people, and became one of the key turning points that shaped the further consolidation of power in the hands of the sitting president. Meaning, each of these episodes was a serious national crisis, not a routine change of government. The night of the 2016 coup attempt itself became one of the most dramatic episodes in modern Turkish history. The president addressed the nation via a mobile phone video call broadcast on television, urging citizens to take to the streets against the mutinying soldiers, and thousands of ordinary Turks, including plenty who weren't ruling party supporters, genuinely did go out to confront tanks with their bare hands, an event Turkish authorities later officially made into an annual national holiday, Democracy and National Unity Day. The mass purges that followed the coup attempt hit not just military personnel, but tens of thousands of teachers, judges, and civil servants, accused in internal investigations of ties to the movement the government blamed for orchestrating the mutiny, a process human rights organizations around the world criticized for insufficiently individualized charges and mass dismissals without proper judicial review of each case, making it one of the most contested episodes in modern Turkish history from a fair trial standpoint. The Turkish military, incidentally, historically saw itself not as an ordinary armed force, but as the direct heir and guardian of Ataturk's secular principles, which explains its repeated interventions in politics throughout the 20th century. Every time military leadership felt the civilian government was straying too far from the secular principles laid down by the republic's founder. This self-image of the military as guardians of the republic was officially enshrined in the Constitution until reforms in recent decades significantly limited the army's political role in the Turkish state system. After such a dense political bloc, it makes sense to head back to lighter ground, culture and traditions, where the myths keep coming, but the emotional temperature is a lot lower. First myth in this category: Turkish cuisine is just shawarma, döner, and kebab. Nothing else worth trying. Döner itself, in its current street food form, incidentally, wasn't invented in Turkey at all. It was invented by Turkish immigrants in West Berlin in the 1970s, who came up with serving traditional spit-roasted meat as a compact sandwich for a quick meal on the go. And that Berlin adaptation then came back to Turkey itself in its modified form and was reinterpreted there for local tastes. A funny example of a dish the whole world considers quintessentially Turkish, actually being the product of migration-driven cultural exchange between two countries. Döner and its many variations really are one of Turkey's most recognizable culinary exports. But Turkish cuisine as a whole is one of the richest and most geographically diverse in the world, combining Mediterranean, Caucasus, Balkan, and Middle Eastern traditions. Dozens of types of meze, both cold and hot shared table appetizers. A rich baking tradition, from flaky borek to sweet baklava. A huge variety of soups, lamb and fish preparation that differs from region to region, and a whole rich vegetarian tradition built around eggplant, legumes, and olive oil, which most tourists who never leave the hotel buffet or a street döner stand don't even know exists. Turkish cuisine was officially added to UNESCO's list of humanity's intangible cultural heritage in 2010 as part of the broader Mediterranean culinary tradition, underscoring its recognized value to the international expert community. well beyond simple street fast food. And the regional cuisine of the Black Sea coast alone, built around corn flour, cabbage, and a small anchovy called hamsi, is different enough from the Mediterranean version of Turkish cooking that locals there jokingly call themselves a separate culinary nation within the country. The southeastern city of Gaziantep was granted UNESCO's City of Gastronomy status in 2015, specifically for its cuisine, built around pistachios, an incredible variety of baklava styles made there since Ottoman times, and a distinct local kebab style locals consider far more authentic than the simplified versions sold under the same name at fast food chains around the world. Meaning, even the single word kebab hides an enormous regional diversity of recipes that gets completely lost in the touristy generalization. Turkish sweets are also far more elaborate than the one baklava recipe famous worldwide. Lokum, known in the West as Turkish delight, dozens of milk pudding varieties based on rice flour, and a distinctive ice cream from the Maraş region made from goat's milk and orchid root flour called salep, which has such a stretchy, dense texture that vendors traditionally sell it through whole theatrical performances with spoons and trays, putting on a show before finally handing the customer their scoop. Eastern and southeastern Anatolian cuisine, in turn, is much spicier and closer in spirit to Caucasus and Iranian culinary traditions, with plenty of walnut, pomegranate, and distinctive rice pilaf style, while coastal Aegean cuisine is built around olive oil and seafood in a Mediterranean style, meaning a trip across Turkey from east to west for a food lover is comparable to traveling through several entirely different culinary worlds within the borders of one country. Turkish street food is also far more varied than just doner. Simit, a sesame-crusted ring of bread that's something between a bagel and a pretzel, is sold on practically every corner as the cheapest and most common city breakfast, and mussels stuffed with rice and spices, sold right in the open half-shell from street carts, remain one of the most recognizable snacks along the Istanbul waterfront, something most foreign tourists don't even know exists. Myth number 2. Turkish TV soap operas are just cheap melodrama with no artistic value. Turkey's television industry has, over the past 15 years, turned into one of the world's largest exporters of scripted TV content, trailing only the United States in international sales volume. And Turkish dramas air in dozens of languages, from the Arab world and Latin America to Eastern Europe and Russia, pulling in audiences in the millions. Sure, among the hundreds of shows produced every year, there's plenty of flat-out, formulaic melodrama. But the same industry also produces projects with serious budgets, high-quality cinematography, and ambitious historical or dramatic storylines that have picked up recognition at international television festivals. Judging the whole industry by its weakest examples is just as unfair as judging all of American film by one low-budget movie. Turkish historical dramas like the show about the life of Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent pulled in audiences in the millions across the Middle East and the Balkans, sparking local political debates in some countries over exactly how shared Ottoman history gets portrayed. A rare case of an entertainment TV product becoming the subject of serious diplomatic and cultural discussion at a regional level. Exporting Turkish TV shows brings the country hundreds of millions of dollars a year, according to industry reports. And some Latin American channels, in certain years, gave more primetime airtime to Turkish content than to their own local soap operas. A striking and fairly rapid market shift for an industry traditionally associated with Latin American telenovelas. The success of Turkish TV abroad has also spawned its own tourism niche. Tours to filming locations for popular shows, including palaces along the Bosphorus and Istanbul's old neighborhoods, have become their own product for tour operators catering to Latin American and Middle Eastern audiences, for whom visiting a specific location from a favorite show is sometimes the main, not secondary, reason for a trip to Turkey. Myth number 3. The hammam and other traditional Turkish practices exist purely for tourists and have long lost any connection to real local life. The Turkish bath really is heavily marketed as a tourist attraction in resort areas, but the tradition of public bathhouses has a centuries-long history. And in certain neighborhoods of major Turkish cities, especially among the older generation, it still remains part of a weekly, everyday social ritual, separate from the tourist format. More an example of the same cultural tradition existing in two parallel formats.
A commercial one for foreigners and an everyday one for locals, a pattern typical of a lot of historical cultural practices worldwide. Some of the oldest still operating Turkish baths, like the Çemberlitaş Hamam in Istanbul, were built back in the 16th century, designed by the famous Ottoman architect Sinan, who also designed dozens of mosques, bridges, and aqueducts across the empire, and is considered one of the greatest architects of the pre-industrial era, right alongside the great Italian Renaissance master.
Even though his name is far less known outside specialized architectural circles in the West than his European contemporaries. And these baths continue to welcome both tourists and local regulars at different time slots or in different sections of the complex, making them a living example of an ancient tradition coexisting with the modern tourism industry under one roof. Turkish baths traditionally also played an important social role that isn't obvious to an outside observer at first. The women's section of the hammam served for centuries as one of the few legitimate spaces where women could gather in large groups outside the home without male chaperones, swap news, and even scout out potential brides for their sons. Meaning the public bathhouse historically served as a full-fledged social club, not just a hygiene facility, in a society with stricter gender segregation of public space. The massage ritual, familiar to most tourists at a hammam, an intense scrub with a rough kiss mitt followed by a soapy massage on a hot marble slab in the center of the room, originally served a purely practical hygienic function rather than a relaxation one, in an era when regular access to hot running water at home was far from universal, and the bathhouse remained the one place where a body could be properly washed and steamed in the cold season. Myth number 4. Turkish coffee is the strongest coffee in the world. Turkish coffee really is made in a distinctive way, finely ground, unfiltered, brewed in a special pot called a çezve, which produces a rich flavor and the characteristic grounds at the bottom of the cup that people traditionally even read fortunes from. But by objective caffeine content per serving, Turkish coffee isn't actually a record holder among the world's brewing methods, precisely because of the small serving size. Some espresso styles, and certainly strong filter coffee, can beat it in caffeine concentration. Meaning the myth of record-breaking strength is more about the rich flavor and dense texture of the drink than any real pharmacological effect. The tradition of preparing Turkish coffee made UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List in 2013, and the whole culture around serving it involves a full, unwritten ritual. A small sweet alongside the coffee, a glass of water beforehand to cleanse the palate, and, of course, reading the coffee grounds after the cup has been flipped onto its saucer and cooled, which remains a popular pastime among friends catching up far beyond just a tourist attraction. The name of the famous European coffee drink, cappuccino, incidentally, according to one linguistic theory, is indirectly tied to Turkish cultural influence via the Balkans and Austria, where Turkish coffee became known after the sieges of Vienna in the 17th century, meaning even the Italian coffee culture we take for granted carries a faint imprint, in places, of centuries of Turkish cultural presence in Europe, something most people never think about over their morning cappuccino. Myth number 5. Literally all Turkish women wear the hijab. Wearing the hijab in Turkey remains a personal choice for women, not a universal mandatory practice. On the streets of any big Turkish city, you'll see women in a traditional headscarf, women in a modern, stylish hijab that's become part of its own fashion industry, and women with their heads uncovered entirely, all at once. And the ratio varies a lot depending on region, age, and social environment. It's telling that until 2013, wearing the hijab was officially banned in government offices and universities as part of the country's secular constitutional tradition.
and only a relatively recent liberalization of that rule allowed women in hijab to freely work in the public sector and study at universities. Meaning the historical situation was actually the opposite of the common stereotype of forced hijab wearing. Plenty of older Turkish women still remember having to literally take off their headscarf at the university entrance, or temporarily put on a wig over their hijab just to attend classes in the 1990s and 2000s.
Personal stories. Turkish journalists and researchers actively collect today precisely because that experience contrasts so sharply with the modern image of Turkey as a country where the hijab is supposedly a mandatory feature of everyday womanhood. The modern Turkish hijab fashion industry has itself grown into a notable segment of the economy. Several Turkish modest fashion brands have grown into recognizable international companies, with shows at fashion weeks in various countries, and influencers promoting stylish combinations of hijab with modern clothing pull in millions of followers on local and international social media, which pretty thoroughly demolishes the image of the hijab as a symbol purely of a traditional, unfashionable lifestyle. The history of the ban, and the later lifting of the ban on the hijab in government offices, became the subject of fierce political disputes inside Turkey for decades. The secular part of society long saw lifting the ban as a threat to the foundations of the secular state Ataturk built, while the conservative part saw the previous ban as a direct violation of religious freedom. Meaning one single piece of clothing became a symbolic battleground for years between two competing visions of Turkish identity, which, to an outside observer, looks like a disproportionately serious source of political conflict. It's telling that the country's current First Lady wore the hijab for a long stretch of time, back when it was still formally banned in government offices, which, at the time, made this detail a subject of intense scrutiny from Turkish and international media, as a symbol of one specific family's personal stand against the official secular policy of the era. Similar disputes over public symbols of religious identity regularly crop up in far more secular European countries too. Just think of the long legal battles over the hijab in French public schools. So the intensity of the Turkish hijab debate itself fits into a much broader global context of tension between the secular state and religious expression, rather than being some uniquely Turkish anomaly. And the last myth in the culture block: the confusion around the names Istanbul and Constantinople, as if it were a simple, deliberate renaming of the city by the Ottomans after their conquest. The real story of the name is far more interesting. The city carried many names throughout its history, even before 1453. And the word Istanbul most likely comes not from an Arabic or Turkish root, but from a Greek phrase literally meaning "to the city," a direction of travel that, over time, turned into a settled name, which linguists consider a far more plausible account than the myth of an abrupt, deliberate renaming. Officially, the name Istanbul wasn't fixed as the sole official name until the 1920s, under Ataturk's Republican government, almost 500 years after the Ottoman conquest. Which makes the myth of an immediate renaming by the conquerors historically inaccurate. For nearly 5 centuries after the conquest, both Ottomans and foreign travelers often kept using both names in parallel, in different contexts. Constantinople, more often in official diplomatic correspondence with European powers, and Istanbul in the everyday speech of local residents. Meaning the real story of the name looks a lot more like a gradual, centuries-long coexistence of two names than the sudden, one-time act of renaming so often used to illustrate the fall of Byzantium in popular retellings. The Hagia Sophia itself, one of the city's most recognizable symbols, has, over its 1,500-year history, been the main Christian cathedral of the Byzantine Empire, then a mosque after the Ottoman conquest, then a secular museum by Ataturk's decision in 1934, and then, in 2020, converted back into a working mosque by presidential decree. meaning the fate of this one single building is itself a far better illustration of the city's whole layered religious and political history than any retelling of the renaming myth. The last block of today's breakdown covers geography, Ottoman history, and Turkey's modern place in the world. First myth. Turkey is entirely located in Asia. Istanbul is the only megacity in the world physically located on two continents at once. The Bosphorus Strait splits the city into a European and an Asian half, connected by several bridges and an underwater metro tunnel. And millions of the city's residents cross the continental border every day just on their commute to work, without giving it a second thought as anything special. That said, the vast majority of the country's territory, the Anatolia region, really is geographically part of Asia, while the European part, Eastern Thrace, takes up a relatively small area. So the myth isn't entirely baseless when it comes to overall land area. But it's completely wrong when it comes to the country's biggest and most famous city. Because of this quirk, some international sports and cultural organizations have spent years arguing over which continental federation Turkish clubs and events formally belong to. Turkish soccer has historically been integrated into Europe's UEFA structures rather than Asian ones, which, for a country whose land area is mostly Asian, is an interesting example of how historical, cultural, and diplomatic factors sometimes outweigh pure geography in determining which continental bloc a country belongs to. The annual Istanbul Across Two Continents Marathon, the only race in the world where participants literally cross the Bosphorus by bridge, starting in Asia and finishing in Europe, has become one of the country's most recognizable sports tourism events, purely thanks to this unique geographic feature that can't be replicated anywhere else on the planet. The Bosphorus Strait also remains one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, carrying dozens of large cargo ships every day heading from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and back, which makes it not just a tourist attraction with views of Ottoman sultans' palaces on both banks, but a strategically critical trade artery for a number of Black Sea states, including Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia, whose grain and other exports physically cannot avoid this narrow sea corridor. Myth number 2. The Ottoman Empire was just a Turkish nation-state, nothing remarkable compared to other empires of its era. At its height in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire controlled territory on 3 continents at once, from the Balkans and North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and the Caucasus, and was one of the most ethnically and religiously diverse powers in world history, where Turks made up only part of the population alongside Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and dozens of other people living under a relatively tolerant for its time system known as the millet system, which let religious communities keep their own courts and internal self-governance. The modern Republic of Turkey is a nation-state that emerged from the wreckage of this multi-ethnic empire after its collapse following World War I. Not a direct continuation of some uniform Turkish state that had existed for centuries. The millet system meant, in practice, that Orthodox Greeks, Armenian Apostolic Christians, and Sephardic Jews lived within the empire for centuries with their own religious courts, schools, and even separate taxation, keeping internal cultural autonomy in exchange for loyalty to the Sultan, a model modern historians who study empires comparatively often cite as a relatively advanced way, for its era, of governing a multi-confessional state compared to the far harsher assimilationist policies of some European monarchies of the same period. It was out of this centuries-old mosaic of peoples that the modern states of the Balkans and the Middle East eventually emerged, as the empire gradually collapsed through the 19th and early 20th centuries, and the Republic of Turkey itself was only proclaimed in 1923 on the far more compact territory of Anatolia by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after the empire lost World War I and following the subsequent War of Independence against occupying forces from several European powers. That War of Independence, in which Turkish forces under Ataturk's command repelled an attempt to partition and occupy Anatolia by the victorious Allied powers, still holds a central place in Turkish national identity and school history curricula, which partly explains Turkey's particular sensitivity in its modern foreign policy around questions of territorial integrity and sovereignty. Myth number 3. Turkey is a small country. By land area, Turkey is bigger than any country in continental Western Europe and comparable in size to France and Spain combined, and its population exceeds 80 million people, making it larger than most European countries and comparable in population to Germany. Istanbul alone has a bigger population than many entire European countries combined, including Sweden, Norway, or Denmark, making it the largest city in Europe by population, even though most of the city, by land area, technically sits in the Asian part of the continent, which brings us back once again to the geographic confusion discussed earlier. Population density varies so much across different parts of Istanbul that the historic peninsula on the European side, with its centuries of buildings, sits right alongside completely new residential districts that have grown explosively on the Asian side over the past 2 decades, in areas that were mostly fields and small suburban villages as recently as the 1990s. A visual contrast striking enough to catch off guard even tourists who visited the city 10 or 15 years ago and no longer recognize entire neighborhoods today. The perception of Turkey as a compact resort country largely comes from the fact that the vast majority of tourists only see a narrow coastal strip with no real sense of the country's interior scale, which stretches thousands of kilometers deep into Anatolia, all the way to the Iranian border. To put it in familiar American terms, the distance from Turkey's western border to its eastern border is roughly comparable to driving from New York to Denver. And Turkey borders 8 countries at once: Greece, Bulgaria, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, through the Nakhchivan exclave, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. A fairly surprising fact for a country the popular imagination associates first and foremost with a beach coastline. Few other countries in the world border such a geopolitically mixed set of neighbors at once, from EU members to Middle Eastern states caught up in armed conflict. It's precisely this proximity to conflict zones in Syria and Iraq that has led Turkey, over the past decade, to take in more refugees than practically any other country in the world. Millions of Syrian citizens, creating a massive domestic political and social challenge for Turkish society, one that spawned its own series of myths and stereotypes inside Turkey itself about the refugees, in many ways mirroring the stereotypes Europeans apply to Turkish migrants in Germany or the Netherlands. This unique position at the crossroads of several regions also makes Turkey a natural energy transit hub. Several major oil and gas pipelines connecting fields in the Caspian region to European markets run through Turkish territory, and plans to turn the country into an additional gas distribution hub for Russian gas have been discussed at the highest levels. One more example of how geography makes Turkey an indispensable intermediary regardless of the political moment. The whole idea of this kind of gas hub actually gained traction after the Nord Stream pipelines in the Baltic Sea were damaged, after which some European buyers started looking at the Turkish route as one of the few remaining physical alternatives for getting Russian pipeline gas to the European market while bypassing direct routes through active war zones. Myth number 4. Turkey has no meaningful soft power or cultural influence beyond its own borders. We've already talked about Turkish TV dramas as one of the country's biggest cultural exports worldwide. But Turkish cultural influence doesn't stop there. Turkish pop music is popular across the Middle East and the Balkans. Turkish cuisine, through döner and its many variations, has become one of the most common street foods worldwide, from Germany to Australia. And Turkey's defense industry, especially its Bayraktar attack drones, gained such widespread international recognition after several recent conflicts that songs and memes about them have popped up in multiple countries at once. A rare case of a piece of military hardware becoming, on its own, a recognizable pop culture item. Beyond that, Turkish construction firms carry out massive projects,
from skyscrapers in the Gulf states to entire city districts in Africa. Turkish Airlines flies direct routes to more countries out of a single hub than practically any other airline in the world, which is itself a form of soft power,
connecting the country by transport links to literally every continent. And Turkish, through TV dramas and labor migration, has become one of the most widely studied second languages in the Balkans and parts of the Middle East over the past 2 decades. Turkey's State International Cooperation and Development Agency, its equivalent of Western humanitarian aid agencies, runs projects across dozens of countries in Africa and Asia, from building schools and hospitals to restoring historical monuments, something some international observers call a systematic, deliberate soft power strategy through humanitarian diplomacy, ambitious enough to rival similar programs run by far wealthier countries. After the devastating earthquakes in Morocco, Libya, and Afghanistan in various years, Turkish rescue teams were among the first to arrive at the scene as part of international humanitarian missions, something the Turkish government deliberately uses as a tool for its own international image as a reliable, fast-acting humanitarian partner, especially given Turkey's own painful first-hand experience with devastating earthquakes on its own soil. And the last 35th myth for today. Turkey is a technologically backward country entirely dependent on imported foreign technology. Turkey's defense industry has made a noticeable technological leap over the past 2 decades, independently developing and mass-producing combat drones now bought by dozens of countries around the world, including ones with far bigger defense budgets. And Turkey's auto industry recently unveiled its own fully domestically developed national electric car brand called TOG, whose launch was broadcast on national television as a matter of state importance and personally overseen at the highest levels of government as a symbol of technological independence, much the way South Korean or Japanese national car projects were once seen by their own societies as a sign the country had joined the club of industrialized nations. Turkey also has a developed aerospace and shipbuilding industry, and is one of the few countries in the world capable of independently producing a full range of certain types of military hardware, from small arms to warships, meaning that, as with plenty of other countries covered in videos like this one, the outdated image of technological backwardness doesn't match the reality of the past decade and a half. Turkish tech startups in e-commerce and financial services have also attracted billions of dollars in investment from major global venture funds in recent years. And Istanbul regularly shows up in rankings of the fastest-growing tech ecosystems among emerging markets in Europe and the Middle East, rivaling far better-known tech hubs like Tel Aviv or Warsaw in this respect. The Turkish food and grocery delivery app Getir was, in its time, one of the first companies from an emerging market to attract a multi-billion-dollar valuation from leading global venture funds and successfully export that same business model to European and American markets, rather than the other way around. A rare case of exporting the technology and business model itself, not just finished physical goods, from a developing economy to richer countries. Turkey's aerospace industry is also developing its own next-generation domestic fighter jet, and the country's relatively young National Space Agency has already put several domestically designed satellites into orbit and announced an ambitious program to send a national mission to the moon in the coming years, meaning the country is simultaneously investing in defense technology and a peaceful space program, a fairly unusual combination of ambitions for a middle-income country. Turkey's defense industry is also actively developing naval drone systems and underwater drones, and Turkish shipyards have, in recent years, landed orders to build frigates and support vessels not just for the country's own navy, but for export to countries in Southeast Asia and Latin America. A fairly rapid and striking transformation for an industry that was almost entirely dependent on imported technology as recently as the 1990s, over a period that's short by defense industry standards. Turkish analysts often point to Western arms and technology embargoes imposed on Turkey by some countries at various points in recent history over political disagreements as a key trigger for the accelerated development of the country's own defense industry. something that, paradoxically, worked not as a deterrent but as a mobilizing factor, pushing the Turkish government toward massive investment specifically in independent domestic production of critically important weapon systems. The first Turkish citizen to visit the International Space Station in 2020 got there through a commercial contract with a private American company rather than a state program, which itself nicely illustrates the current stage of Turkey's space program. The country is already ready to invest in a human presence in space, but for now relies on partnerships with more experienced players for crewed missions specifically, while keeping independent satellite and drone development for itself. That flight itself triggered a wave of national pride on Turkish social media, comparable in intensity to the reaction to major sports victories, which shows just how symbolically important the country's technological and scientific prestige on the world stage remains to Turkish public self-image, alongside the more familiar categories of soccer achievements or military strength. Turkish school children and students also regularly place at international math and science Olympiads, and several Turkish universities have climbed in global education rankings in recent years, something Turkey's education ministry cites as evidence of the growing quality of the national higher education system. Though independent experts note this achievement coexists with a broader problem of underfunded basic science compared to wealthier OECD countries. Brain drain also remains a notable problem for the Turkish economy. A significant share of graduates from Turkey's top technical universities have, in recent years, preferred to move abroad to work in Germany, the UK, or the US right after graduating, drawn by higher salaries and stability, creating something of a paradox where the country trains world-competitive technical talent while simultaneously losing a large share of it to richer economies, where those same specialists often end up working for local branches of the very same Turkish tech companies. The Turkish government has, in recent years, launched several state programs aimed at bringing emigrated specialists back, including tax breaks and grants for starting a business domestically, though the results of these initiatives remain fairly modest compared to the scale of the skilled labor outflow problem. A similar dynamic of young professionals leaving shows up in other developing economies at a comparable income level too, from Eastern Europe to parts of Latin America. So brain drain by itself isn't a uniquely Turkish problem. It's a systemic feature of any economy where the wage and career gap with richer countries stays wide enough to justify emigration for an ambitious young professional. Interestingly, alongside the outflow of Turkish specialists to the West, a notable number of expats from Europe and North America have, in recent years, been moving to Turkey to work, drawn by the lower cost of living while keeping a remote Western salary. Meaning, skilled labor migration flows today run in both directions at once, just for different reasons and in different professional niches. Istanbul and coastal towns like Fethiye have, in recent years, become popular destinations specifically for this category of remote worker, spawning a local infrastructure of co-working spaces and English-speaking communities that closely resembles similar expat enclaves in Bali or Mexico, just with a far less internationally known reputation for this role so far. Though that seems to be changing fairly quickly, as more Western publications write about digital nomads discovering the Turkish coast as a budget alternative to the far more hyped destinations of Southeast Asia, helped along by direct flights and simplified visa rules for citizens of dozens of countries that make Turkey logistically far more accessible for Europeans than flying to the other side of the world for the same combination of sea, cheap rent, and reliable internet. And the time zone gap with most European countries is only 1 or 2 hours, which, for someone working remotely for a European employer, turns out to be far more practical than the multi-hour gap with Southeast Asia, where a colleague's workday in London, Berlin, or Paris ends right around when a digital nomad's day in Bali is just getting started, making real-time collaboration nearly impossible without someone having to constantly sacrifice their schedule. And now we're back where we started. Remember that composite image of a country of controlling men, tourists getting scammed at every turn, and a dictator holding power with no real elections? As you can now see, the reality turned out to be far more layered.
Some of the stereotypes held up, at least in part. Some turned out to be serious exaggerations, and the political bloc in particular forced us to balance between two extremes on almost every single point. Turkey isn't a glossy travel agency brochure, and it isn't a scary evening news headline either. It's a huge, internally diverse country sitting at the crossroads of several civilizations at once, where a conservative Anatolian village and a secular Istanbul neighborhood exist within the same national borders, while living in very different social realities. If you made it this far, you've just spent more than 2 hours with me, and that's worth a separate thank you.